Mother Bear refused to leave this disabled boy on wheelchair and followed him into the forest. What happened next put everyone in tears. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Every bit of your support helps us create even more amazing stories for you. The soft, golden light of dawn crept through the curtains of Jacob Bennett's bedroom, gently waking the 12-year-old from his dreamless sleep. From his window, he could see the dense forest that bordered his family's cottage, its mysterious depths calling to him as they did every morning. Jacob sighed, his eyes traveling to the wheelchair beside his bed, a constant reminder of the accident that had taken his ability to walk 3 years ago. His fingers traced the wheels absently, feeling each groove and indent like an old friend. Another day, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the chorus of birdsong that floated through his half-open window. The forest seemed particularly alive today, the leaves whispering secrets as they danced in the gentle breeze. Jacob's heart ached with longing. How he wished he could explore those woods like other children, to feel the soft earth beneath his feet instead of the hard rubber of his wheelchair wheels. With practiced movements, Jacob transferred himself from bed to chair, wincing slightly at the effort. His mother, Sarah, had built a wooden ramp that extended from their back porch to the edge of the tree line, allowing Jacob at least some freedom to observe the wildlife that occasionally ventured near their home. It wasn't the same as truly exploring, but it was something. A small window into the world that had been largely closed to him since the accident. "Jacob, breakfast," his mother called from the kitchen, her voice warm, but tinged with the familiar worry that seemed to follow Jacob wherever he went. He could almost picture her glancing anxiously at the clock, counting the minutes until she needed to leave for work, calculating how long Jacob would be alone until his aunt arrived to check on him. "Coming, Mom," he called back, wheeling himself through the narrow hallway. The cottage smelled of pancakes and maple syrup, Sarah's special way of starting off the day with something sweet. Jacob's father had passed away shortly before the accident, and since then it had just been the two of them, holding each other through the darkest moments and celebrating the smallest victories. After breakfast, Sarah kissed his forehead, her touch lingering as if she could somehow transfer her strength to him. "Aunt Lisa will be here around noon with lunch. Promise me you'll stay close to the house." Her eyes, so like Jacob's own deep brown, pleaded with him silently. "I promise, Mom, just to the edge of the forest and back," Jacob replied, the same words he spoke every morning. Sarah nodded, satisfied but never completely at ease, and headed off to her job at the local clinic. The moment her car disappeared down the gravel road, Jacob felt the familiar pull of the forest growing stronger. He wheeled himself onto the back porch, down the ramp, and toward the tree line. The morning air was crisp against his face, carrying the scent of pine and wild flowers. Jacob breathed deeply, closing his eyes to better absorb the symphony of nature around him. This was his favorite time of day, when the world felt both peaceful and alive with possibilities. As Jacob opened his eyes, his breath caught in his throat. There, at the edge of the forest, barely 20 feet away, stood a massive brown bear. Her fur gleamed copper in the morning light, and her intelligent eyes seemed to study Jacob with curiosity rather than hostility. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest, but strangely, he didn't feel afraid. Something in the bear's demeanor spoke of gentleness, of a shared understanding that transcended the natural boundaries between human and wild creature. The bear remained perfectly still, her head slightly tilted as she observed the boy in the wheelchair. Jacob noticed her rounded belly and swollen teats, a mother bear, most likely with cubs nearby. Everything he had ever been taught about bears warned him to retreat slowly. to make himself scarce without turning his back. Yet he couldn't move, transfixed by the connection he felt with this magnificent animal. For what seemed like an eternity, they remained locked in this silent communion, neither advancing nor retreating. Then, with a soft snort, the mother bear turned her head toward the forest, as if beckoning Jacob to follow. A sudden crack of branches in the distance broke the spell, causing the bear to tense visibly. She looked back at Jacob, then toward the source of the sound, her behavior growing increasingly agitated. Jacob's fingers tightened on his wheels. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And somehow, this wild mother bear was trying to tell him. Without fully understanding why, Jacob inched his wheelchair forward, crossing the invisible boundary that separated his safe, familiar world from the untamed wilderness. The bear watched him approach, her dark eyes holding neither fear nor aggression, only an urgent, almost human concern. When Jacob was just a few feet away, she made a low rumbling sound deep in her throat. It wasn't a growl of warning, but something softer, more plaintive. "What is it, girl?" Jacob whispered, surprised by his own boldness. "What's wrong?" As if understanding his words, the mother bear turned and took several steps into the forest, then looked back at Jacob expectantly. When he didn't immediately follow, she returned to him, circling behind his wheelchair and gently nudging it forward with her massive head. Jacob gasped at the contact, but the bear's touch was surprisingly gentle, almost maternal in its care. "You want me to follow you?" Jacob's voice trembled with both fear and exhilaration. Every warning he'd ever heard about wild animals screamed in his head, yet his heart told him this was different. This wasn't a predator seeing him as prey. This was a sentient being asking for help. The bear nudged his chair again, more insistently this time. The path before them was uneven, littered with fallen branches and exposed roots, nearly impossible terrain for a wheelchair. Yet the mother bear seemed to understand this challenge. She positioned herself beside Jacob, offering her substantial body as a support when his wheels caught on obstacles. "I can't believe this is happening," Jacob muttered to himself as he gripped his wheels tightly, following the bear deeper into the forest than he'd ever ventured before. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air grew cooler, the sounds of the outside world fading into a primal quiet, broken only by their movement and the occasional call of a distant bird. 10 minutes into their strange journey, Jacob's arms burned with exhaustion. The terrain was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate, and twice he nearly tipped over when his wheels caught on hidden roots. Each time, the mother bear was there, her solid body preventing him from falling. Despite his growing fatigue, Jacob pushed forward, drawn by an inexplicable need to discover what had so troubled this magnificent creature. They crested a small rise, and Jacob heard it, a high-pitched, plaintive whimper that cut through the forest's silence like a knife. The mother bear quickened her pace, leading Jacob toward a dense thicket of thorny bushes approximately 50 yards ahead. As they drew closer, the whimpering intensified, punctuated by frightened yelps that tore at Jacob's heart. "Is that your cub?" Jacob asked, receiving another soft rumble in response. The mother bear pressed forward, maneuvering around the thicket to a small clearing on the other side. There, tangled in a mess of thorny vines and what appeared to be an abandoned piece of rusty barbed wire, lay a small bear cub. The sight nearly broke Jacob's heart. The tiny creature, no larger than a medium-sized dog, was desperately struggling against its bonds, its soft brown fur matted with dirt and flecked with blood where the thorns and wire had pierced its skin. With each movement, the cruel barbs dug deeper, causing the cub to cry out in pain. The mother bear approached her offspring, gently nuzzling the cub's head while making soothing sounds. She turned to Jacob, her eyes seeming to plead for his help. The message was unmistakable. She had brought him here because her powerful paws were too clumsy for the delicate work of freeing her baby without causing more injury. "I understand now," Jacob said softly, wheeling himself as close as he could to the trapped cub. "I'll help you, little one. Just try to stay still." The cub regarded Jacob with terrified eyes, but the mother bear moved to her baby's head, continuing to make gentle sounds that seemed to calm the frightened animal. Taking a deep breath, Jacob reached out with trembling hands toward the tangled mess of thorns and wire. "This is going to hurt a bit," he warned, "but I'll be as gentle as I can." As Jacob's fingers made contact with the first thorn, the cub flinched but remained relatively still under its mother's watchful guidance. With painstaking care, Jacob began the slow process of untangling the vines and carefully extracting the barbed wire that had become wrapped around the cub's hind legs and belly. Blood welled from tiny punctures in Jacob's fingers as the thorns bit into his skin, but he barely noticed the pain. His entire focus was on freeing this innocent creature, on easing its suffering. In that moment, his own limitations, the wheelchair, his disability, seemed to fade into insignificance. Here, in this forest, he wasn't defined by what he couldn't do, but by what he could. "Almost there," Jacob murmured encouragingly as he worked the last section of wire free from the cub's matted fur. "Just one more bit." With a final gentle tug, the last of the cruel metal pulled away, and the cub was free. It lay still for a moment, as if unable to believe its ordeal was over. Then, with a tentative movement, it rose shakily to its feet, testing its injured limbs. The mother bear immediately began to clean her cub's wounds, her tongue gently washing away the dirt and blood. Jacob sat back in his wheelchair, suddenly aware of how far from home he was and how much his arms ached from the exertion. But the pain seemed trivial compared to the overwhelming sense of accomplishment that flooded his chest. He had done something today that few able-bodied people would have dared. He had helped a wild bear in distress. The cub, now free and comforted by its mother's attention, turned curious eyes toward Jacob. With halting steps, it approached the wheelchair, sniffing curiously at the metal frame and rubber wheels. Then, to Jacob's astonishment, the cub rose on its hind legs and placed its front paws on his knees, looking directly into his face with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. "You're welcome," Jacob whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "Take good care of yourself now." As if understanding, the cub dropped back to all fours and returned to its mother's side. The mother bear gave her baby one more thorough inspection before turning her attention back to Jacob. She approached slowly, her massive head level with his as she sat in his chair. For a heart-stopping moment, Jacob thought she might attack, a delayed reaction to having a human so close to her vulnerable offspring. Instead, the bear did something that would stay with Jacob for the rest of his life. She leaned forward and gently, so gently he could barely feel it, touched her nose to his forehead in what could only be described as a gesture of profound gratitude. Her warm breath fanned across his face, carrying the wild scent of the forest and something else, a connection that transcended the boundaries between their species. The moment was broken by the distant sound of voices calling Jacob's name. His mother must have returned early, found him missing, and organized a search. The mother bear tensed, her protective instincts immediately on alert. With one last look at Jacob, a look that seemed to contain both gratitude and farewell, she nudged her cub toward the deeper forest, away from the approaching humans. "Jacob, Jacob, where are you?" His mother's voice was closer now, tinged with panic. "Here," Jacob called back, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm over here." As he watched the bears disappear into the shadow of the trees, the mother gently herding her limping cub, Jacob felt a profound sense of loss mingled with his joy. For a brief, magical hour, he had been more than the boy in the wheelchair. He had been a helper, a healer, a necessary link in a chain of events that had saved a life. The forest suddenly parted as Sarah burst into the clearing, her face ashen with fear. Behind her came Aunt Lisa and two neighbors, all looking equally distressed. "Jacob Bennett!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side and dropping to her knees beside his wheelchair. "What on earth were you thinking, coming this far into the forest alone? You could have been—" Her voice caught as she noticed the scratches on his hands and the tears on his face. "Oh, sweetheart, what happened? Are you hurt?" Jacob stared at his mother, suddenly realizing how impossible his story would sound. A mother bear asking for his help, being guided through the forest, freeing a cub from barbed wire. Even he was beginning to doubt the reality of the experience. "I'm fine, Mom," he said softly. "Better than fine, actually. I needed to help someone today." Before Sarah could question him further, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught everyone's attention. The mother bear had returned, standing just within the tree line, her cub safely hidden behind her. The adults gasped in fear, pulling closer to Jacob protectively, but Jacob himself felt no alarm. "It's okay," he said, raising a hand to calm the adults. "She's not going to hurt us." As if confirming his words, the mother bear made a soft chuffing sound, her eyes fixed on Jacob. Then, with deliberate movements, she sank down on her front paws in what could only be described as a boo, before rising again and disappearing into the forest for the final time. The adults stood frozen in shock, trying to process what they had just witnessed. But Jacob understood perfectly. In that brief return, the mother bear had given him a final gift. Confirmation that the connection they had shared was real, not a product of his imagination. She had also provided witnesses to an encounter that might otherwise have been dismissed as a child's fantasy. "Jacob," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did that bear just bow to you?" Jacob smiled through his tears, his heart fuller than it had been since before the accident that took his ability to walk. "She was saying thank you," he said simply, "and goodbye." As the adults helped guide Jacob's wheelchair back through the difficult terrain toward home, he kept glancing over his shoulder, hoping for one last glimpse of his unlikely friends. The forest remained still, offering no further signs of the bears, but Jacob didn't need visual confirmation. He could feel the change within himself, a new confidence, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. That night, as Sarah tenderly bandaged the thorn pricks on his hands, Jacob finally shared the full story of his adventure. To his surprise, his mother didn't dismiss his tale as imagination or exaggeration. Perhaps seeing the bear's final acknowledgement had opened her mind to possibilities beyond her understanding. "I always knew you were special, Jacob," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But today, even a wild creature recognized what I've known all along, that your heart and your courage have nothing to do with whether your legs can carry you." Jacob fell asleep that night with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. In his dreams, he ran alongside a mother bear and her cub through endless forest paths, free from the constraints of his wheelchair, boundless as the wilderness itself. And when he woke the next morning, though his legs remained still, his spirit soared with newfound strength. The story of the boy in the wheelchair and the grateful mother bear spread throughout their small community, then to neighboring towns, eventually reaching local news outlets. Many dismissed it as a heartwarming fiction, But those who had witnessed the bear's final acknowledgement knew better. And Jacob? Jacob knew that some connections transcend words, transcend species, transcend physical limitations, because true strength comes not from the body, but from the willingness to help others, even when that help seems impossible to give. In the years that followed, Jacob became an advocate for wildlife conservation and accessibility in nature areas, eventually helping to design wheelchair-friendly paths through the same forest where he had met his bear friends. His story inspired many, and while some still doubted the truth of his encounter, Jacob never wavered in his conviction. The memory of that day sustained him through difficult times, through grueling physical therapy sessions that, while not restoring his ability to walk, strengthened his upper body to new levels of independence. By the time Jacob turned 16, 4 years after his encounter with the bears, he had become something of a local celebrity. The wheelchair-accessible nature trail he had helped design was nearly complete, winding through parts of the forest that had previously been inaccessible to people with mobility challenges. Local newspapers featured stories about the Bear Boy, as some had taken to calling him, and his tireless advocacy for both wildlife protection and disability accessibility. It was early spring when Jacob received an unexpected phone call. Dr. Eleanor Rivera, a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior, had heard his story and was intrigued enough to want to meet him. "I've been tracking bear populations in this region for over a decade," Dr. Rivera explained when she arrived at Jacob's home the following weekend. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. "And I've documented some unusual behavior patterns in a particular female bear that might correlate with your experience." Jacob's heart quickened. "You think it might be the same bear?" Dr. Rivera smiled cautiously. "I can't say for certain, but this particular bear has shown unusually low aggression toward humans and has been spotted several times near the edges of developed areas, observing people from a distance. She also has a distinctive scar across her right shoulder blade that wasn't there in my earlier documentation." "A scar?" Jacob frowned, trying to remember if he had noticed any marks on the mother bear during their encounter. "Yes, and here's where your story gets particularly interesting," Dr. Rivera continued, pulling out her tablet and showing Jacob a series of photographs. "Based on the timing, this bear would have been pregnant or recently given birth around the time of your encounter. And this scar? It's consistent with barbed wire injury." Sarah, who had been quietly listening, gasped softly. "You're saying the mother bear might have been injured by the same wire that trapped her cub?" Dr. Rivera nodded. "It's a possibility. Bears are incredibly intelligent creatures with long memories, especially regarding threats to their offspring. If this mother had a previous negative experience with barbed wire, it might explain why she sought human assistance instead of attempting to free her cub herself." Jacob stared at the photographs, his throat tight with emotion. The bear in the images was older than the one he remembered, but there was something in her eyes, a knowing intelligence that struck a chord of recognition. "There's something else, Doctor," Rivera said, hesitating slightly. "The cub, now a juvenile, has developed in a way that's statistically unusual. Despite having had an early injury that would typically disadvantage a young bear, this one has thrived. More remarkably, it displays anomalous behavior around humans with disabilities." "What do you mean?" Jacob asked, leaning forward in his wheelchair. "Last summer, a hiker with a prosthetic leg encountered this juvenile bear on a trail about 5 miles from here. Instead of running or displaying aggression, the bear simply observed him from a distance, following parallel to the trail for nearly half a mile before disappearing back into the forest. 2 months later, A similar encounter was reported by an elderly woman using a walker. In neither case did the bear show any interest in their food or backpacks, only in the humans themselves and their mobility aids. The implications were almost too extraordinary to contemplate. Could the bear cub that Jacob had rescued have somehow associated humans with mobility challenges as helpers rather than threats? The scientific part of his mind knew this was anthropomorphizing, projecting human qualities onto wild animals. Yet his heart remembered the intelligence in those bears' eyes, the deliberate nature of their actions. Dr. Rivera seemed to read his thoughts. "I know it sounds far-fetched," she admitted. "Most of my colleagues would dismiss it as coincidence or misinterpretation, but I've been studying bears long enough to know there's still so much we don't understand about their cognitive capabilities and emotional lives." She paused, fixing Jacob with a serious look. "That's why I'm here. I'd like your help with a research project. A careful, controlled study of this bear family's behavior, with proper safety measures in place, of course." Jacob could hardly believe what he was hearing. The chance to potentially reconnect with the bears that had changed his life was both thrilling and terrifying. "What exactly would this involve?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Initially, observation only. We've set up wildlife cameras along several trails, including the new accessible one you've helped design. If you're willing, I'd like you to use that trail regularly, following a research protocol designed to minimize risk while maximizing data collection." Sarah immediately voiced her concerns, as Jacob had expected she would. The mother bear might have shown extraordinary restraint during their previous encounter, but she was still a wild animal capable of killing a human with a single swipe of her powerful paw. No matter how touching their previous interaction had been, safety had to be the priority. After much discussion and careful planning, a compromise was reached. Jacob would help with Dr. Rivera's research, but only under strictly controlled conditions. They would always work in a group, with trained wildlife specialists present. Jacob would never be alone, and they would use a specially designed mobile blind that could protect him while still allowing for observation and data collection. The project began the following weekend. For the first 3 outings, they saw plenty of wildlife, deer, foxes, even a bobcat, but no bears. Jacob tried to hide his disappointment. Perhaps the bears had moved on to a different territory, or perhaps the presence of a research team was scaring them away. Then, on their 4th expedition, everything changed. It was an unusually warm day for early spring. The forest was awakening from its winter slumber, tiny green buds appearing on tree branches and early wildflowers dotting the forest floor. Jacob sat in his wheelchair inside the specially designed blind, a lightweight structure of mesh and reinforced carbon fiber that allowed visibility while providing protection. Dr. Rivera and her assistant, Marco, were positioned about 30 feet away with camera equipment, while Sarah remained near Jacob, her presence a concession to her lingering concern for his safety. They had been waiting quietly for nearly 3 hours when Jacob noticed a subtle change in the forest's atmosphere. The birds, which had been cheerfully singing all morning, suddenly fell silent. A tension seemed to fill the air, an electrical charge of anticipation that made the hair on his arms stand up. He recognized this feeling. He had experienced it 4 years ago, just before the mother bear appeared at the edge of the forest. "Something's coming," he whispered to his mother, who squeezed his shoulder in response. Through hand signals, they alerted Dr. Rivera, who immediately checked her equipment to ensure everything was recording properly. The silence stretched on for several long minutes. Then, with a deliberate slowness that suggested caution rather than fear, a large brown bear emerged from the dense underbrush about 50 yards ahead of them. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Even from this distance, he could see the distinctive scar across her right shoulder. This was her, the mother bear who had sought his help years ago. She was alone this time, her cub, now a young adult bear, nowhere in sight. She stood perfectly still, her nose raised to test the air, undoubtedly picking up their scents despite the blind's design to minimize odor. For a heart-stopping moment, Jacob feared she would turn and flee. Instead, she did something that left even Dr. Rivera speechless. The bear began to walk directly toward their position, not with the cautious shuffle of a bear detecting potential threats, but with the purposeful gait of one approaching a familiar destination. When she was approximately 20 yards away, close enough for Jacob to see the individual hairs of her thick coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight, she stopped and sat back on her haunches, her dark eyes fixed unwaveringly on the blind where Jacob sat. "She knows you're here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling between fear and awe. "Somehow, she knows it's you." Jacob nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The bear's behavior defied conventional wildlife biology. Bears didn't sit and stare at humans. They either avoided them or, if threatened or habituated to human food, might approach aggressively. This calm, almost contemplative observation was unprecedented. For nearly 10 minutes, the bear remained in this position, watching. Then, just as Dr. Rivera was whispering into her digital recorder about the extraordinary duration of the bear's attention, another rustle came from the underbrush. A second bear, smaller but still substantial, emerged to join the first. "The cub," Jacob breathed, recognizing despite the years of growth the bear he had freed from barbed wire and thorns. Now, nearly full-grown, the younger bear had a distinctive gait, a slight favoring of its left hind leg that was likely a permanent result of its early injury. The younger bear approached its mother cautiously, clearly aware of the human presence, but taking its cue from the older bear's calm demeanor. After a brief interaction that included what appeared to be a sharing of scents, the younger bear sniffing near its mother's face, both bears turned their attention back to the blind. What happened next would become the centerpiece of Dr. Rivera's research paper, and would challenge conventional understanding of bear cognition and memory. The mother bear stood on her hind legs, a position that would normally signal aggression or curiosity, and extended one paw toward the blind, holding it there in a gesture that seemed almost like a greeting. The younger bear, after a moment's hesitation, mimicked its mother's behavior. Inside the blind, Jacob felt an overwhelming urge to respond, to acknowledge this extraordinary greeting. Against the frantic whispers of caution from his mother and the research team, he slowly raised the mesh window of the blind and lifted his hand in return. The bears remained motionless, their paws still raised, their eyes fixed on Jacob's hand. No one dared breathe. Then, with a soft chuffing sound that carried clearly through the still forest air, the mother bear dropped back to all fours. The younger bear followed suit, and together they turned and walked unhurriedly back into the dense forest, disappearing as quietly as they had come. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Dr. Rivera's camera shutter and the shaky exhale of relieved tension from everyone present. Jacob lowered his hand slowly, a smile spreading across his face even as tears blurred his vision. 4 years, he said softly. 4 years, and they remembered. Dr. Rivera's research, published the following year in a prestigious wildlife biology journal, would spark intense debate in scientific circles. Some dismissed her findings as anthropomorphism, a projection of human qualities onto animal behavior. Others argued that her documentation provided compelling evidence for complex cognitive abilities in bears that had been previously underestimated. For Jacob, however, the scientific controversy mattered little. The connection he had experienced, both during his initial encounter and during the research expedition, transcended scientific explanation. It was a bond forged in a moment of mutual need and trust, a reminder that compassion could bridge the widest of divides, even those between species. As the years passed, Jacob's life took unexpected turns. The story of his bear encounters inspired him to pursue a degree in wildlife biology, with a focus on the cognitive abilities of large mammals. His unique perspective as someone with a disability gave him insights that many of his colleagues missed, allowing him to recognize patterns of behavior and adaptation that paralleled his own experiences navigating a world not designed for his needs. On his 25th birthday, Jacob received an unexpected gift from his university department, a specially designed all-terrain wheelchair that would allow him to venture deeper into wilderness areas than ever before. The chair, with its robust wheels and battery-assisted propulsion, represented freedom in its purest form. The first place Jacob took his new chair was, of course, the forest where it had all begun. Sarah, now with streaks of gray in her hair but still fiercely protective of her son, insisted on accompanying him, though she gave him space to experience the moment on his own. The forest had changed over the years, as forests do. Trees had fallen, new ones had grown, the undergrowth had shifted and transformed. Yet there was a familiarity to it, a sense of homecoming that made Jacob's heart swell with emotion as he navigated his high-tech chair along paths both old and new. He stopped at a small clearing, not the same one where he had freed the bear cub all those years ago, but similar in its dappled light and peaceful ambiance. Sarah waited at the edge of the clearing, allowing him this moment of reflection. "I never thought I'd be back here like this," Jacob said, half to himself and half to the forest around him. "Never imagined I'd find a way to truly belong in these woods." A rustling sound from beyond the clearing caught his attention. Jacob held his breath, not daring to hope yet unable to stop himself from doing exactly that. But it wasn't bears that emerged from the underbrush, just a family of deer, pausing briefly to regard him before bounding away. Jacob smiled, feeling a mixture of disappointment and contentment. The bears had given him so much already, it would be greedy to expect more. Their encounters, however brief, had shaped the course of his life, had helped him find purpose and meaning in the aftermath of devastating loss. That was gift enough for anyone. As he turned his chair to rejoin his mother, a flash of movement at the far edge of the clearing caught his eye. There, partially obscured by foliage but unmistakable to Jacob's searching gaze, stood a large brown bear. It was impossible to tell from this distance whether it was the same mother bear from all those years ago. She would be quite elderly for a wild bear by now, or perhaps her offspring, or even an unrelated bear entirely. What mattered was not the bear's identity, but the moment of quiet acknowledgement that passed between them. Two creatures sharing a forest home, each navigating life's obstacles in their own way, each finding strength in unexpected connections. The bear remained still for several heartbeats, its eyes meeting Jacob's across the clearing. Then, with a gentle motion that might have been coincidence but felt to Jacob like a final farewell, the bear dipped its head slightly before turning and disappearing into the depths of the forest. Jacob sat motionless in his chair, tears streaming down his face. Whether this was the same bear or not, whether the gesture was intentional or imagined, the moment felt like the closing of a circle, the completion of a story that had begun with fear and pain but had transformed into something beautiful and profound. "Goodbye," he whispered to the empty forest. "And thank you." As Jacob rejoined his mother and they made their way back to the trailhead, he felt a sense of peace washing over him. His disability had once seemed like an insurmountable barrier, cutting him off from the natural world he loved. Yet it was that very disability that had created the conditions for his extraordinary encounter with the bears, an encounter that had not only changed his life, but had possibly changed how people understood these magnificent creatures as well. Life, Jacob had learned, often revealed its greatest gifts in the wake of its deepest challenges. And connections, whether between humans and animals, between past and present, or between limitation and possibility, could emerge in the most unexpected places, as long as one remained open to their power and their promise. The forest around him hummed with life as Jacob made his way home, his heart full of gratitude for all that had been and all that was yet to come. 5 years later, Jacob found himself standing, yes, standing, at the podium of an international wildlife conservation conference in Geneva, Switzerland. The journey that had brought him here still felt surreal at times. 2 years after receiving his all-terrain wheelchair, Jacob had been selected for an experimental medical trial involving spinal stimulation therapy combined with intensive rehabilitation. The treatment hadn't restored full function to his legs, but it had given him something doctors had once deemed impossible: the ability to stand for short periods and even take a few assisted steps with specialized braces. "Thank you all for the warm welcome," Jacob began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Before him sat hundreds of the world's leading wildlife biologists, conservationists, and environmental policymakers. My story begins not with scientific ambition, but with an encounter that defied everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between humans and wild animals. As Jacob shared his experiences with the bears, now supported by years of subsequent research and documentation, he could see skepticism on some faces gradually transform into fascination. The video footage captured during Dr. Rivera's research expeditions, showing bears exhibiting behavior that challenged conventional understanding, had become cornerstone evidence in studies of animal cognition. "What I'm proposing today," Jacob continued, reaching the heart of his presentation, "is a fundamental shift in how we approach wildlife conservation. Rather than viewing human accessibility and wildlife protection as competing interests, I believe they can be complementary forces. When we create thoughtful access to natural spaces for people of all abilities, we also create more advocates for wilderness preservation." The conference marked a pivotal moment in Jacob's career, but an even more significant development awaited him upon his return home. A letter had arrived during his absence, bearing the official seal of the State Department of Natural Resources. The forest where Jacob had encountered the bears, which had since been expanded into a larger protected wilderness area, was being threatened by a proposed mining operation that had discovered valuable mineral deposits near its eastern boundary. "They can't be serious," Sarah said, reading the letter over Jacob's shoulder. Though in her 60s now, her fierce protective instincts remained unchanged, except they now extended beyond her son to encompass the forest and its inhabitants as well. "After everything we've learned about the ecological importance of that area..." Jacob's jaw tightened as he continued reading. The mining company had significant political influence and had already secured preliminary approvals for exploratory operations. Public hearings would begin in 30 days, with a final decision expected within 6 months. "We need to stop this," Jacob said, determination hardening his voice, not just for the bears, but for everything that forest represents. What followed was an intensive grassroots campaign unlike anything their small community had ever seen. Jacob leveraged his growing reputation in wildlife conservation circles to rally support. Dr. Rivera contributed scientific data demonstrating the unique behavioral patterns observed in the local bear population. Community members who had witnessed Jacob's extraordinary encounters or had been touched by his story came forward with their own testimonials about the forest's importance. As the date of the public hearing approached, tension mounted. The mining company had deployed their own experts, who argued that their operations would be minimally invasive and would create much-needed jobs in the region. They dismissed Jacob and Doctor. Rivera's research as emotional anthropomorphism, lacking scientific rigor, despite its publication in peer-reviewed journals. The night before the hearing, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat in his wheelchair on the back porch of the cottage where he had grown up, gazing toward the forest that had shaped his life in so many ways. The full moon cast silver light across the landscape, illuminating the tree line where he had first encountered the mother bear all those years ago. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted to Sarah, who had joined him with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "What if we fail? What if they destroy it all?" Sarah placed a weathered hand over her son's. "You've never let impossible odds stop you before," she reminded him gently. "Not when you were 12 and ventured into that forest to help a bear cub. Not when doctors said you'd never stand again, and not now." As Jacob opened his mouth to respond, a sound from the edge of the forest caught their attention, a soft huffing that was distinctly ursine. Both mother and son froze, straining their eyes to see through the moonlit darkness. There, at the precise spot where Jacob had first seen the mother bear 15 years earlier, stood not 1 bear but 3. A large female with a familiar scar across her shoulder, a younger adult that Jacob recognized as the once injured cub, and, most surprisingly, a tiny bear cub, probably only a few months old. "Is that?" Sarah whispered, her grip on Jacob's hand tightening. "It's them," Jacob confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's a new generation." The realization struck him like a physical force. The once injured cub was now a mother herself, continuing the lineage that Jacob had helped preserve through his long-ago act of compassion. The bears remained at the forest's edge for several minutes, clearly visible in the moonlight, before the youngest generation grew restless and began to play, tumbling in the grass with the exuberance of youth. The sight brought tears to Jacob's eyes, tears of joy, but also of fierce determination. This wasn't just about saving a forest or protecting a species. It was about preserving the possibility of connection across the boundaries that humans erected between themselves and the natural world. The public hearing the next day was standing room only. Jacob, using his braces and walking aids, chose to stand while delivering his testimony, a physical demonstration of his own journey that wasn't lost on anyone present. He spoke not just of scientific data or conservation principles, but of personal transformation, of the profound impact that wilderness could have on human lives when it was preserved and made accessible. "The bears you see in these videos," he said, as the footage from Dr. Rivera's research played on the large screen behind him, "are not just biological entities functioning on instinct. They are intelligent, sentient beings capable of memory, of gratitude, of teaching new behaviors to subsequent generations. And last night, 15 years after I first encountered them, they returned to the edge of our property with a new generation, as if to remind us of what's at stake here today." A murmur ran through the audience. The mining company representatives exchanged skeptical glances, clearly preparing to dismiss Jacob's testimony as emotional manipulation. But before they could speak, the back doors of the hearing room opened, and a latecomer entered. Dr. Helena Torres, the world's foremost authority on bear cognition, whose research at major universities had revolutionized understanding of animal intelligence. "Forgive my interruption," Dr. Torres said, her authoritative voice silencing the room instantly. "My flight was delayed, but I've reviewed Mr. Bennett's research extensively, and I'm here to offer my professional assessment." What followed was a scientific validation that even the mining company's experts couldn't easily dismiss. Dr. Torres methodically outlined how Jacob and Dr. Rivera's observations aligned with cutting-edge understanding of bear cognition, memory, and social learning. She presented comparative data from her own global studies, placing the local bear population's behavior in the context of worldwide research. In my 30 years studying bear behavior across 4 continents, Dr. Torres concluded, I have never encountered more compelling evidence for complex cognitive processes than what has been documented here. To destroy this habitat would not only be an ecological tragedy, but would eliminate a unique opportunity to advance our scientific understanding of animal intelligence. The hearing extended late into the evening, as community members, scientists, and industry representatives presented their arguments. When the panel of officials finally called for a 2-week deliberation period before announcing their decision, Jacob felt both exhaustion and cautious hope. They had made their case as strongly as possible. Now they could only wait. Those 2 weeks were among the longest of Jacob's life. He continued his daily routines, his physical therapy, his research work, his advocacy, but everything felt suspended, as if the future itself were holding its breath. Each evening he would wheel or carefully walk himself to the edge of the forest, hoping for another glimpse of the bears, but they didn't return. When the day of the decision finally arrived, the same hearing room was packed even more tightly than before. Jacob sat between Sarah and Dr. Rivera, their hands linked in silent solidarity as the head of the review panel approached the podium. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, the official began, her face giving no hint of the decision to come. This panel has reached a unanimous conclusion. The room collectively held its breath. The proposed mining operation is denied permitting within the designated wilderness area and surrounding buffer zone. The cheers that erupted drowned out the rest of her statement. Jacob found himself enveloped in hugs from all sides, tears flowing freely down his face. They had done it. They had saved the forest, the bears, and all they represented. But the official wasn't finished. When the room finally quieted, she continued. Furthermore, in recognition of the unique ecological and scientific significance of this area, the department is recommending its redesignation as a National Wildlife Research Reserve, with special provisions for continued study of the unusual bear population, documented by Mr. Bennett and Dr. Rivera. This announcement brought a second wave of celebration, even more jubilant than the first. Not only had they prevented destruction, but they had secured a higher level of protection that would preserve the forest for generations to come. As the crowd dispersed, many stopping to congratulate Jacob personally, he found himself approached by an unexpected figure, the CEO of the mining company that had sought to develop the land. Mr. Bennett, the executive said, extending his hand somewhat stiffly, I want you to know that while this isn't the outcome my company hoped for, I was moved by your testimony. I have a granddaughter with cerebral palsy who loves the outdoors, and your work on accessible nature trails has given me something to think about. Jacob accepted the handshake, recognizing the significance of this small moment of bridge building. I'd be happy to share our designs with you, he offered. Every child deserves to experience wilderness, regardless of their physical capabilities. The months that followed brought a whirlwind of activity. The newly designated National Wildlife Research Reserve received federal funding for expanded studies of bear behavior, with Jacob and Dr. Rivera leading the research team. The accessible trail system was extended, incorporating innovative designs that minimized environmental impact while maximizing access for people with varied mobility needs. Most remarkably, The mining company CEO made good on his implied promise. His corporation established a foundation dedicated to creating accessible wilderness experiences for children with disabilities, with Jacob serving as a consultant. The first project, a fully accessible observation platform overlooking a meadow frequented by wildlife, was named Sarah's Lookout, in honor of the woman who had built the first simple ramp that allowed her son to reach the forest's edge. On the day of the platform's dedication ceremony, Jacob stood alongside his mother, now using just a single cane for support after years of intensive therapy. The gathered crowd included scientists, local families, representatives from disability advocacy groups, and even a contingent from the mining company, their presence a testament to how perspectives could shift when people opened themselves to new understanding. This platform represents more than accessibility, Jacob said during his remarks. It represents possibility, the possibility that we can find ways to connect with nature that honor both human needs and wilderness protection. The possibility that we can bridge divides between different communities with seemingly opposing interests. And the possibility that sometimes the most extraordinary connections can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. As if to punctuate his words, a movement at the forest edge caught the audience's attention. A collective gasp rose as 3 bears emerged into the distant meadow, the same family group that had appeared to Jacob and Sarah the night before the crucial hearing. Though too far away for direct interaction, they were clearly visible through the binoculars and spotting scopes set up along the platform railing. The bears moved unhurriedly through the tall grass, the youngest member occasionally standing on hind legs to better see over the vegetation. They showed no alarm at the distant human presence, seeming almost to perform for their audience as they foraged and played. "You know," Dr. Rivera murmured to Jacob as they watched, "in all my years studying bears, I've never seen a family group willingly remain visible to humans for this long. It's almost as if they're acknowledging us," Jacob finished for her, a smile spreading across his face, "making sure we know they're still here." Whether this was scientific fact or wishful thinking hardly seemed to matter in that moment. What mattered was the tangible connection being forged between the humans on the platform and the wild creatures in the meadow. A connection that transcended species, that honored difference while celebrating commonality, that recognized the intricate web binding all living things together. As the dedication ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Jacob remained at the railing, his eyes fixed on the bears as they gradually made their way back toward the forest depths. Just before disappearing into the trees, the largest bear, the matriarch with the distinctive scar, paused and rose onto her hind legs, her silhouette stark against the backdrop of green foliage. For a long moment she remained in that position, her head turned toward the observation platform. "Goodbye for now, old friend," Jacob whispered. "Thank you for everything." Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Jacob sat alone on the new platform, savoring the solitude after the day's busy events. The forest was transitioning from its daytime rhythms to its nighttime ones, diurnal creatures settling down as nocturnal ones began to stir. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a frightened boy in a wheelchair following a bear into the forest, to a man who had helped reshape how humans understood and interacted with wildlife, it was a path he could never have imagined for himself. A soft rustling from the nearby bushes interrupted his thoughts. Jacob tensed briefly, then relaxed as a familiar figure emerged onto the platform, Dr. Helena Torres, the renowned bear cognition expert whose testimony had been so crucial to their cause. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, taking a seat beside him. I wanted to speak with you privately before I leave tomorrow." "Not at all," Jacob assured her. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for us." Dr. Torres smiled, her eyes reflecting the first glimmers of moonlight. "I came here skeptical, you know. Despite my work on animal intelligence, I found the reports of your experiences difficult to reconcile with established science." "And now?" Jacob asked. "Now, I find myself reconsidering the boundaries of what's possible," she admitted. "But that's not why I wanted to speak with you tonight." She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small flash drive. "This contains research that hasn't been published yet. Studies from a remote region in Romania where local villagers have reported similar unusual interactions with bears. Nothing as dramatic as your experience, but suggesting patterns that can't be easily explained by conventional wildlife biology." Jacob accepted the drive, understanding its significance. "You think there might be other bears forming unusual connections with humans?" "I think," Dr. Torres said carefully, "that we've barely scratched the surface of understanding animal cognition, and that your experience here might not be as unique as we've assumed. The implications for conservation could be profound. If more people could see wildlife not just as resources to be managed or threats to be controlled, but as sentient beings capable of recognizing and responding to human compassion." She let the thought hang unfinished in the night air. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, listening to the symphony of the forest at night. "There's something else, Doctor," Torres finally said, her voice softer now. "Something I haven't shared publicly because it's not scientifically verifiable, but that I think you of all people might understand." Jacob turned to her, curious. In the moonlight, he could see a vulnerability in her expression that her professional demeanor had previously concealed. 20 years ago, I was conducting fieldwork in Alaska," she began. "I got separated from my research team during a sudden storm and fell into a ravine, breaking my leg badly. I was miles from base camp with no communications equipment. The temperature was dropping rapidly." Jacob listened intently, sensing where this story might be heading but not wanting to interrupt. A grizzly had been feeding in the same valley earlier that day. "We'd observed it from a distance," Dr. Torres continued. "As I lay there, unable to move, certain I would die of hypothermia before my team could find me, that same bear appeared on the ridge above me. I was terrified, of course. In my condition, I couldn't even attempt to defend myself." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "Instead of attacking, the bear came down to where I lay. It circled me several times, sniffing. Then it lay down beside me, close enough that I could feel its body heat but not touching me. It remained there throughout the night, while the temperature dropped well below freezing. When my research team found me the next morning, the bear simply got up and walked away." "The bear saved your life," Jacob said softly. "It kept you warm enough to survive." Dr. Torres nodded. "I've never included this in any official report or publication. My colleagues would have questioned my objectivity, perhaps even my sanity. But I've carried that experience with me through every study, every paper, every observation of bear behavior. The certainty that there's something more there. Something deeper and more complex than science has yet been able to measure or explain." Jacob reached out and covered her hand with his own, a gesture of understanding that needed no words. Their shared experiences, though separated by decades and geography, had opened a window into a realm where conventional boundaries between human and animal blurred into something more profound. "Perhaps," Jacob suggested, "that's the most important conservation work we can do, not just protecting habitats and species, but protecting the possibility of connection. The spaces where humans can encounter the wild not as something alien and separate, but as another form of consciousness with which we share this planet. As they sat together under the spreading canopy of stars, the forest alive with night sounds around them, Jacob felt a sense of completion, unlike anything he had experienced before. The circle that had begun with a boy in a wheelchair and a mother bear seeking help had expanded to encompass scientists and policymakers, community members and corporations, creating ripples of change that would continue long after his own lifetime. And somewhere in the darkened forest beyond, he knew, 3 bears were making their own way through the night, living their wild lives, forming their own connections, and perhaps, in ways humans might never fully understand, remembering the encounters that had changed the fate of their forest home. The story of the boy and the bears would continue to be told, evolving with each telling, inspiring new generations to look beyond the limitations of conventional understanding to the possibilities that emerge when compassion bridges the divide between different worlds. And in that continuing story lay a profound truth, that the most transformative journeys often begin with the simple courage to follow where unexpected connection leads. 20 years later, on a crisp autumn day, much like the one when he'd first encountered the mother bear, Jacob, now in his 50s, made his way along the accessible trail that wound through the National Wildlife Research Reserve. His movements were slower now, age and the long-term effects of his original injury making themselves known in new ways, but his eyes remained sharp and alert as they scanned the familiar landscape. He was alone today, a rare luxury. Sarah had passed peacefully in her sleep 5 years earlier, having lived to see her son become not just a respected scientist but a transformative figure in wildlife conservation. Dr. Rivera had retired to write her memoirs, though she still consulted on the research programs she and Jacob had established. The forest itself had thrived under protection, growing wilder and more vibrant with each passing season. Jacob paused at a viewpoint overlooking the valley where so much of their bear research had been conducted. The observation platform had been rebuilt twice over the years, each iteration incorporating new technology that allowed visitors to observe wildlife without disturbing natural behaviors. Today, however, no school groups or tourists populated the viewing areas, just Jacob and his memories. The bears they had studied for so long, the mother with the scarred shoulder and her offspring, had long since passed into whatever afterlife awaited such remarkable creatures. Their legacy lived on in their descendants, who still showed unusual tolerance for human observers, and in the volumes of research their behavior had inspired. Most importantly, they lived on in the fundamental shift in how humans understood their relationship with wild animals, a shift that had begun with a disabled boy following a bear into the forest. As Jacob sat enjoying the panoramic view, a movement in the valley below caught his attention. A young woman in a wheelchair was navigating one of the accessible trails, accompanied by a service dog. Even from this distance, Jacob recognized Lily Morgan, a doctoral student whose groundbreaking work on animal-assisted therapy had been partly inspired by Jacob's own story. Lily had been born with spina bifida, never knowing what it was like to walk. Yet she moved through the forest with confidence and grace, her specially designed chair allowing her to traverse terrain that would have been impossible for Jacob's childhood wheelchair. The golden retriever at her side was both companion and research subject. Part of Lily's work involved measuring how service animals responded to the presence of wild counterparts. Jacob watched as Lily reached a small clearing and stopped. Her attention suddenly focused on something just beyond Jacob's line of sight. The service dog tensed briefly, then relaxed, taking its cue from Lily's calm demeanor. Jacob shifted position slightly, trying to see what had captured the young researcher's attention. There, partially obscured by underbrush but clearly visible to Lily's position, stood a large female bear with 2 cubs. Jacob's breath caught. There was something in the bear's stance, in the tilt of her head as she regarded the human in the wheelchair, that seemed hauntingly familiar, despite the generations that had passed. Lily remained perfectly still, her body language relaxed and open. The bear, after a long moment of mutual observation, did something that sent a shiver of recognition down Jacob's spine. She rose briefly onto her hind legs, not in a threat display but in what almost appeared to be a gesture of acknowledgement, before dropping back to all fours and guiding her cubs in a wide, careful circle around the clearing where Lily sat. As the bears disappeared into the forest, Jacob could see even from a distance that Lily was crying, her hand pressed to her mouth in wonder. He understood those tears all too well. The overwhelming emotion of connecting across an impossible divide, of being seen and acknowledged by a wild creature in a way that transcended ordinary understanding. In that moment, watching a new generation experience the same profound connection he had known, Jacob felt a sense of completion unlike any he had experienced before. The circle was unbroken. The story continued. What had begun as his personal journey had become something larger and more enduring, a legacy of connection that would outlive him, inspiring others to find their own pathways through limitation to possibility. That evening, as sunset painted the forest in shades of gold and amber, Jacob made his way to the small memorial garden that had been established near the visitor center. Sarah's ashes had been scattered here, along with those of several researchers and community members who had been instrumental in protecting this special place. A simple stone bench provided a place for reflection, surrounded by native wildflowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds during the warmer months. Jacob eased himself onto the bench, feeling the day's exertions in his aging body. As twilight deepened around him, he closed his eyes, allowing memories to flow through him. The frightened boy he had been, the mother bear's gentle nudge guiding his wheelchair, the feeling of thorns pricking his fingers as he freed the trapped cub, the years of research and advocacy that followed, the battles won and lost, the lives touched and changed. A soft sound broke into his reverie, footsteps approaching on the garden path. Jacob opened his eyes to see Lily wheeling toward him, her service dog padding quietly alongside. Her face still held the radiant wonder of her encounter with the bears. "Dr. Bennett," she said as she reached him, her voice tight with emotion. I can't believe—" She stopped, seemingly unable to find words adequate to the experience. "You saw the bears," Jacob finished for her gently, "and they saw you." Lily nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "It was exactly like your story. The way she looked at me. It was like she knew, like she understood." She hesitated. "People have always told me your experience was unique, maybe even embellished over time. But today you had your own story begin," Jacob said, reaching out to cover her hand with his weathered one. "And that's how it continues. Not just through research papers or conservation policies, but through moments of connection that change how we see ourselves and our place in the world." They sat together as darkness fell completely, the first stars appearing overhead. In the distance, an owl called, its haunting voice echoing through the forest that had been saved by a boy's courage and a bear's trust. "What happens now?" Lily asked finally, her young face serious in the moonlight. "Where does the story go from here?" Jacob smiled, feeling a profound peace settle over him. "That's for you to discover," he said. "My chapter is drawing to a close, but the story itself, that continues as long as there are those willing to look beyond what seems impossible to what might be possible. As long as there are those brave enough to follow where compassion leads, even when the path seems frightening or unclear." He gazed out at the darkened forest, feeling its presence like an old friend. As long as there are wild places and open hearts, he continued softly, there will always be the possibility of connection across the boundaries we create. That's the gift the bears gave me, not just in that first encounter, but in every moment that followed. The understanding that sometimes the most powerful healing comes from reaching beyond our own limitations to help another living being. Late that night, after Lily had departed with promises to return and share her findings, Jacob remained in the garden alone. The moon had risen, bathing the forest in silver light reminiscent of that long-ago night when he had first spotted the mother bear at the edge of the trees. As he sat in peaceful contemplation, a sound from the nearby undergrowth drew his attention, a soft huffing that was unmistakably bear. Jacob's heart quickened, decades falling away in an instant as he turned toward the sound. There, at the edge of the garden, stood a large female bear. Whether she was a descendant of the original mother bear was impossible to know for certain, but in the moonlight, Jacob could make out what appeared to be a light-colored marking across her right shoulder, a patch of fur rather than a scar, but in precisely the same location. The bear regarded Jacob steadily, showing neither fear nor aggression. Just a calm, almost contemplative awareness that seemed to stretch beyond the moment into all the moments that had come before, and all those yet to unfold. Jacob rose slowly from the bench, supporting himself with the walking stick he now relied upon. With deliberate movements, he stepped forward and raised his free hand in the gesture that had become symbolic of the connection between humans and bears in this special place, not as a claim of dominion, but as an acknowledgement of shared existence. The bear remained motionless, her dark eyes reflecting moonlight as she observed the aging man before her. Then, with a fluid grace that belied her size, she rose onto her hind legs, towering momentarily in the silver light before settling back to all fours. No words were exchanged, for none were needed. In that silent communion beneath the stars, old debts were acknowledged, old promises reaffirmed. The circle that had begun with a frightened boy and a mother bear seeking help had expanded across decades and generations, creating ripples that would continue long after both had returned to the earth from which they came. As the bear turned to leave, disappearing into the shadowed forest with hardly a sound, Jacob felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but of profound gratitude for the extraordinary journey that had been his life. From the moment he had first dared to follow the mother bear into the forest, each twist and turn of his path had led him here, to this moment of perfect completion. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty air where the bear had stood, "for everything." In the years that followed, visitors to the National Wildlife Research Reserve would sometimes report a peculiar sight on moonlit nights: an elderly man and a large bear, walking side by side along the forest paths. Scientists dismissed these accounts as imagination or misidentification, but those who knew Jacob's story understood the deeper truth they contained. When Jacob Bennett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, he was laid to rest in the memorial garden beside his mother. The simple stone that marked his resting place bore only his name, the dates of his life, and a single line that captured the essence of his extraordinary journey: "Compassion knows no boundaries." The morning after his burial, staff arriving at the reserve were astonished to find a perfect circle of bear tracks surrounding the freshly turned earth of his grave, as if a silent vigil had been kept through the night. And at the head of the grave, placed with a precision that defied explanation, lay a single pine cone from the depths of the forest. Some called it coincidence. Others whispered of something more mysterious and profound. But all who knew the story of the boy in the wheelchair and the mother bear who sought his help understood that in this sacred place The boundaries between possible and impossible had long since dissolved into something far more beautiful than either alone could contain. And in forests around the world, wherever humans and wild creatures share the ancient earth, the possibility of connection remains, waiting for those with the courage and compassion to reach across the divide, to see and be seen, to help and be helped in return. For in that mutual recognition lies the seed of healing, not just for individual lives, but for the wounded relationship between humanity and the natural world of which we remain, despite all our technology and separation, an inextricable part. This is the legacy of Jacob Bennett and the bears who changed his life. Not a fairy tale of impossible friendship, but a testament to what becomes possible when we open ourselves to the wisdom and wonder that exists beyond the boundaries of our own experience. A reminder that sometimes the most profound healing comes when we focus not on our own limitations, but on the needs of another living being. And somewhere in the forest, as new generations of bears and humans find their way in a changing world, the story continues, unfolding in moments of unexpected connection, in acts of courage and compassion, in the shared recognition that across all our differences lies a common need for kindness, for understanding, for the healing power of being truly seen. For this is how all great stories live on, not carved in stone or bound in books, but alive in the hearts and actions of those who carry their truth forward. And the truth of Jacob's story was both profound and simple, that compassion, once offered, creates ripples that continue long after the initial act is complete, that connections, once formed, can transcend all boundaries, even those between species, between ability and disability, between life and what lies beyond.